Welcome to PSI's webinar, Lessons of Sandy Hook, How to Make Your School Safer. Hello, I'm Karen McKelvey, PSI's Director of Professional Development, and on behalf of all of us at PSI, we are pleased to host Mrs. Michelle Gay and Dr. Scott Poland. School safety is continually on the minds of educators, parents, and students today. PSI partners with hundreds of schools via our school psychology staff, intervention specialists, special education staff, gifted ESL and remedial teachers, and a wide variety of school health staff. Along with all of you, PSI staff considers of paramount importance the safety of the students with which we work. PSI is pleased to have among its resources such expert partners as Dr. Scott Poland, to train not only PSI staff, but also to provide professional development to our partner schools. We are also so pleased to have joining us today, Mrs. Michelle Gay. Michelle Gay is a mother, former teacher, and now one of the founders of Safe and Sound, a Sandy Hook initiative. After losing her daughter, Josephine Grace, on December 14, 2012, she chose to take action as an advocate for improved school security and safety in our nation's schools. Michelle's background as a teacher and involved parent, along with her personal loss and post-tragedy perspective, have left her uniquely positioned to help school communities prevent tragedy and better prepare and respond in the event of an emergency in their own schools. Michelle holds a Bachelor of Science degree in elementary education from Towson University and a master's degree in curriculum and instruction from McDaniel College. Dr. Scott Poland is a premier expert on school safety and violence prevention and a PSI expert partner. He personally responded in the aftermath of over 13 school shootings and has authored several books and articles on school safety, youth violence, bullying, and suicide. A frequent guest on major network news programs, Dr. Poland is currently on the faculty of Nova Southeastern University and the coordinator of their Suicide and Violence Prevention Office. Before I turn the program over to Michelle and Scott, I want to say that we will be recording this session and it will be archived for further usage by our registrants. If time allows, you can submit questions that will be answered at the end, time allowing. Utilize the control panel on the side, much like an IM. Upon completion of the webinar and submission of an evaluation, you will receive a certificate of completion via email. We will also post the recording of the webinar on the PSI website within a week or so. And now, PSI is pleased to present Michelle Gay and Scott Poland.
Thank you for that introduction, Karen. Thank you, PSI, for hosting today's webinar, and Dr. Scott Poland for co-presenting with me today, and to all of our attendees for being here. I'm having a little difficulty getting it up, so let me just see if it's working there. Okay, I believe you can see my screen. So again, thank you for having me. I am Michelle Gay, as Karen had said. I am the co-founder of Safe and Sound and the mother of Josephine Gay. And I come to you today to present and share with you my perspective on school-based tragedy and some of the lessons that I learned following our tragedy at Sandy Hook and the loss of our daughter, Josephine. It's a unique perspective because we don't often hear directly from parents following a safety or school-based tragedy, and also the fact that I do bring to the table an educator's background. I am a former elementary school teacher as well. So I'm hoping that my perspective today provides the context for our discussion and much of the expertise that Scott will present to us today after my presentation. My day on December 14th, 2012 in Connecticut began like just about any other day. It was cold and gray, and we were approaching the holidays, so there was a lot of busyness going on. But I packed my daughters up, and I sent off my first two to school, one at the intermediate school, and the other at the fourth grade at Sandy Hook. My third, Josephine, was a first grader, and I held on to her a little bit longer that morning because she was recovering from a concussion that she had suffered. So I was just kind of keeping an eye on her and deciding whether I should send her in or not. But inevitably, she was excited to go to school that day, and just a little extra cuddling time on the couch, and she decided she wanted to go in. So she grabbed her backpack and her bag, and we headed off, and she was met at the front door that you see here in the slide by one of her favorite teachers who greeted her and brought her in for another wonderful day at her favorite place to be, school. That was the last time, unfortunately, that I saw her alive, but it was a precious memory, and I have many of them that I carry forward with me. But I have to say, as I drove back home, headed home to get started on all of my stay-at-home mom work and holiday shopping and things like that, I really was unaware of how the day would change for us. And shortly after arriving home, I received a phone call that let me know that there was, in fact, a shooting in our school system somewhere, and our schools were all in lockdown. So unable to reach the intermediate school, unable to reach the staff at the elementary school, I hopped in my car and headed to tour the town to just see if I could find what was going on. About halfway towards the intermediate school, I was overtaken by response vehicles. And at that point, when response vehicles overtook my car, I just began to follow them, and I arrived at the scene that you see here. On the left side, you see an aerial view of Sandy Hook School, and on the right side, you see the firehouse, which is where I arrived first. The firehouse is at the end of that little roadway that leads you up to the school, and I was unable to proceed any further because the response vehicles were already blocking that roadway. So I parked my car, and I could tell very clearly that the emergency was here at our school, much to my surprise. I had expected that I would be landing perhaps at the high school, maybe even the middle school, or that I would be learning that that's some kind of misunderstanding or false alarm. But I got out of my car, and at about that time, I also began seeing lines of children evacuating, much like this line of children that you see here. And they all had their hands on the shoulders in front of the child in front of them, and they were looking downward. And I would learn later that they had been instructed by the first responders to walk out that way so that they were unable to really take in the scene, the damage to the building, and the carnage that they might see while evacuating the building. But I remember when I saw these lines of children thinking how grateful I had been that we in our school community had practiced off-site evacuation. In fact, we had only practiced evacuation a week before this day, and it was something that our staff and our students were familiar with. And aside from a few children that were visibly upset, there was overall a sense of calm and order. The children and the staff, they knew where they were going, and they knew how they were supposed to get there. So I do remember kind of taking mental note and thinking how grateful I was that we had prepared, that we had practiced in this way. I saw in one of those lines my second daughter, my fourth grade daughter, evacuating with her class, and I ran up to her and let her know that everything was okay, and she was to wait for me at our off-site evacuation location as we had practiced, and that once I found her little sister, we would be heading home. And so she did, and she was relieved, I remember, hearing me recite the plan. But as I began to look around, I was having difficulty finding anyone who was in charge and could explain to me where we were in the process and where my younger daughter's class was. I was unable to find anyone who could tell me what had happened and what was going to take place going forward. And I would learn later that the reason for that was that the folks in charge of the plan, our beloved administrators, our our school principal, our school psychologist, and our lead teacher had all been either killed or injured in the very early seconds of the attack. And because of that, there was a great amount of confusion building at this point. This is where chaos began to set in. There were a lot of parents arriving on scene. There were neighbors. There were neighboring business people coming to help to try to figure out what was going on. And without anyone there to step into that role of our leadership, that confusion persisted, and it was really difficult for all of us there on scene. So I continued to look around and try to find some answers. I also continued to look and see how I could send my older daughter home. I knew that I would be waiting for some time for some information about where my youngest was, and at that point I had been assuming that she was still in the building, yet to evacuate. But without anyone in charge, we did have, as I said, the chaos really beginning to build, and many parents were coming and taking their children home without any kind of sign out or presentation of any kind of identification. And because of this, unfortunately, we had a lot of families who were waiting with us families who ended up learning that we had lost a child, and those families had not lost a child. A kind and loving, very well-intentioned neighbor or friend had come and picked up the child without any kind of sign out or identification, and without any record of who had picked that child up. An enormous amount of trauma, an enormous amount of pain was brought upon families that really could have been spared that. So I remember thinking how critical it is to not just have a plan to evacuate, not just have basic emergency plans, but to be sure that we have plans for reunifying our students with their families, and to be sure that they're very orderly and that they are made in mind with keeping the psychological safety in our community, really trying to mitigate any further trauma or damage to already very traumatized families and children. One of the groups that I have found, one of the resources that I found that I look to share at this point in my presentation is the standard reunification method, and it's something that's been created by a foundation called I Love You Guys. You can see their website there, and a visit to their site will give you a lot of information about their organization and their inspiration and the beautiful reason for the name of their foundation. But this is one reunification method that we really value in my organization at Safe and Sound, and many of our expert contributors and advisors also do. So it's definitely worth checking out. It's also a free resource from another fellow nonprofit that is very dedicated to school safety. So once I had finally figured out that day how to send my daughter home with a friend, there was, again, no sign out, but I found a friend to take my 4th grade daughter home to get her out of the chaos, and I did. I began to start to piece together what had happened that morning, and what I learned was an intruder had parked his car just in front of our building where you see the brick wall, and I believe he chose to park his car there because it would allow him to remain out of the line of sight of our office staff. The front office was just inside that entranceway, and by parking his car there, he was able to stay out of sight until the last moment, and he was only, maybe 3 or 4 yards from the entrance of our school. So our intruder exited his car and approached the sort of portico, the little covered entrance there, and he was able to circumvent our locked front entrance and our buzz-in system and our visitor protocols by simply breaking the glass, shooting it out, the glass window beside our front door. And he was able to enter the building within a matter of seconds. And just a few seconds after entering and making all of that noise, he was met by our administrators. They were just down the hall from the entrance in the conference room. So they ran out of the room, and they were immediately met with his gunfire. Dawn Hawksprung, our principal, and Mary Sherlock, our school psychologist, were killed instantly, and our lead teacher, Natalie Hammond, was critically wounded. But she remained down, and I presume that our gunman had figured that he had addressed the threat of the 3 unarmed women, and he had turned his attention to the front office directly in front of him. And he walked in the front office, and it seems, as the women who were hiding in the front office under their desks and in storage closets, they recall him pacing throughout the office, apparently looking for someone to continue his attack upon. And presumably he was unable to find anyone by simply walking around. The women did not have elaborate hiding places, but they found a way to make sure that they were out of sight. And because of that, their lives were saved. He exited that front office, and he began down the long front hallway that you see on the front of the building where all the windows are. The hallway goes down the middle of the building. On the front of the building would be our first grade classrooms and a special education suite. And then the back end of the hallway is where there would be the conference room where the administration came running out of, and some second grade classrooms. Our gunman began walking down that hallway, and he passed the first grade classroom on his left. I presume that this is because he missed it entirely. It was Caitlin Roig's classroom, and she had left the blackout paper over her classroom door window. It was left there from the practice, the lockdown practice and the evacuation practice that the school had just gone through the week prior. And I believe because of this, and because her door was so closely situated in the front of the hallway, I believe he just missed it entirely. So passing by this classroom, he proceeded on to the second classroom on the left side of the hallway, and that was Vicki Soto's classroom. When he entered that room firing, he shot the teacher, Vicki, first, and he began to turn his gun toward the children and began to fire upon them. And he then had to stop to reload his weapon. He was having difficulty with it. Some of the children reported that he seemed frustrated and flustered, and 2 batches of those children took advantage of the situation. 2 children hid in the classroom bathroom while the shooter was distracted, and their lives, thankfully, were spared. And 2 other groups of children evacuated. They self-evacuated together without any adult command or instruction. They were able to exit safely. They turned right and out of their classroom and exited the front entrance, just where our gunman had come in, and they ran down that sidewalk that you see in the front of the building, and they ran out to safety in the community to get help. Our gunman remained in the room until he had killed 2 adults, 2 teachers, and he had killed 5 children. I suppose believing that he had killed everyone in the classroom, he exited the classroom and proceeded further down that hallway and entered the next first grade classroom, my daughter's classroom. And when he entered that classroom, our children had mostly been hidden in the attached bathroom. But there were so many of them that our teachers that were in the classroom, a substitute teacher and my daughter's one-to-one special education aide, stood in front of the children to try to protect them. They were unable to close the bathroom door, so they chose to stand in front of the children. And our gunman walked in and continued to shoot until he believed that everyone in the room was killed. And in fact, one child did survive, and she was rescued by one of our SROs who arrived on scene after everything had ended. In the course of these shootings, the teachers along that front hall and throughout the building had done the best that they could. They had utilized very well the training that they had received and the practice that they had, but it wasn't enough. They were mostly unable to lock their classroom doors because there was no school-wide announcement of a lockdown as we had planned, and most of the teachers did not have their keys on their person, so they had to struggle to find their keys and then make it to the hallway and lock their doors from the outside. That was not a possibility for any of our teachers on that front hallway, although one teacher all the way at the end of the hallway, a kindergarten teacher, did step out into the hallway to do just that, and she was shot in the foot, but has made a recovery physically and was able to survive and lock and close her door. I share these very difficult details with you because it's important, I think, to learn from how our students and our staff reacted and how they utilized their training to the best that they could. It's also very important for us to see how we can better prepare our students and staff in case there should be some type of emergency. Because what we learned that day is that whatever training you have or whatever experience you have as an individual, that will be what you default to. The amount of training, the amount of knowledge, the amount of experience you have and that has been provided for you, the amount of practice that you have is incredibly important to your ability to survive or create safety amidst even the most chaotic and dangerous circumstances. We learned that day that simple measures are critically important and can save lives. I believe that the ability of our teachers to lock and close those doors would have provided a significant deterrent to our intruder. He was hurried and he was looking for easy targets, and any barrier that we could have given our staff and our students to better hide them, to better secure their location, I believe could have helped them exponentially. We also learned that day how very important it is to consider how an emergency is announced in your school. In our case, the plan had been the PA system. We had planned that in the event of an emergency, whatever kind it would be announced over the PA system, and the staff and the students would know how to respond accordingly. With our administration incapacitated within seconds of the attack, there was no one who was able to make that announcement, no one who was empowered to do so, or who even had access to the PA system in order to make that announcement. So our lockdown was actually announced in two unconventional ways, but in ways that would prove to save lives, I believe. In that conference room where our administrators had fled to try to figure out what was going on in the initial moments of the attack, there remained an IEP team. There was a special education meeting going on, and so a couple of the staff members had taken shelter under that conference room table, and one of them reached up to call 911 from the landline, and in doing so, she activated the PA system. And although it was terrifying and very traumatizing for our students and staff to be hearing the attack unfolding over the PA system, I know that hearing those sounds, they were immediately aware that something was very wrong and that they needed to take cover and to employ the protocols that they had practiced. The lockdown was also announced by a custodian of ours who very bravely ran up and down the hallways, manually locking the doors from the outside with the keys on his hip and hollering, "Lockdown, lockdown," informing the students and staff of the situation in very plain language and in a way that let them know what they needed to do. So it's important that we're thinking about what types of communication tools we have and how we are communicating in an emergency. We're often asked, we had a culture of safety in our school. We had an administration and a staff and certainly a parents community that was very committed to the safety of our students and our staff. And here you see a tweet that Dawn had sent out just prior to this attack, where we had practiced our offsite evacuation and our lockdown protocols. Safety first at Sandy Hook. It's a beautiful day for our annual evacuation drill. And you can see the pride on the teachers' faces, and you know how proud Dawn was of her staff. They were making strides, and they were working toward continuing to keep our student body safe. So we're often asked, despite that culture and despite the efforts that were in place at Sandy Hook, how is it that something like this could unfold in this safe little hamlet, in this community that so valued the safety of its students? And I believe, as hard as it is to accept, if we look within ourselves, I believe that the answer is that we believed that that would not happen here. In our safe town, in our community where everyone knew one another, our small town, in our schools that had practiced and that did have plans, we really didn't believe that we would face an emergency on that scale. And I think it's very important for us as the adults in charge, as the parents, as the teachers, the administrators, the first responders in the community, to try our best to move beyond that, to really think carefully about what we would do and how we would respond if, in fact, an emergency like that unfolded in our communities. Despite the fact that we had not thought those things through as parents and as teachers, we found that there were folks who had, and that day they came to our side, and they haven't left us. We have very strong relationships with a lot of the first responders who took care of us that day. I used to really loathe looking at a lot of these pictures online, pictures of our families and our staff at the very worst moments of our lives, learning terrible news, fleeing the scene. But I began recently to take some comfort in the fact that there is always a responder beside us in these photographs, whether it was a volunteer firefighter, an EMT from the neighborhood, an off-duty FBI officer, local or state police. Someone was there with us. Many of them were there with us and have been very committed to our families and our community. We learned that our first responders are essential in the response and recovery that day, but what we had not anticipated, what we had failed to consider, is how critical they are in preparing our communities for these types of tragedies, emergencies, and disasters. I do believe that had we involved our first responders, our local experts, even our federal experts, and had their eyes on our plans and had them participating on a more regular basis in our preparations, our day may have unfolded differently that day. We also learned that day how incredibly important it is to have a recovery team at the ready. We faced a lot of the news that we heard, a lot of the events of that day as families, as parents, as teachers and staff members on our own. We had, of course, not anticipated that we would ever face anything like this, so we did not have a recovery team on call. We didn't have counselors, psychiatrists, psychologists from the community and neighboring towns that could sweep in to provide us the assistance we needed. We were lucky in that we are a tight-knit community, and we had friends and family and each other to lean on, but I cannot help but think how valuable a recovery team would have been for us that day. So I encourage you all to think those steps through and think about who is available and who is at the ready to help your community in the event of an emergency. With all of these lessons that we learned, a handful of us parents got together and we began to share. We began to talk about them, and despite our loss, we wanted to make sure that our children's legacies and memories were continued and built on in a positive way. So we began to talk about how we might take these lessons and put them into something that would help other communities. And we formed an organization called Safe and Sound. We set up a website, safeandsoundschools.org, where we could warehouse a lot of the resources that we have found, a lot of the information that we have learned, and where we could start creating tools and resources of our own to share with these communities. So I encourage you to visit us and check us out. Everything that we offer is for free. And we've done this in honor of the children we lost, of the community that has been so traumatized and hurt by what unfolded that day. As we began to reach out to other experts and other organizations, we began to learn quite a lot about school-based preparedness. We learned that no one has died in a school fire in the United States in over 56 years. We began to think that we've made our schools safer from these fire emergencies through better education and preparation. It's time that we begin to adopt the same sort of mentality for all other areas of school safety. Looks like we're getting this slide again. Hold on. We learned that education and preparation for these 5 to 6 minutes, the national average arrival response time to an emergency, is critical. And we learned that we can prepare to save lives through education and preparation. So that's very much become a part of our mission and something that we are focused on. We begin to organize this information with our model, Straight A Safety. And for us, this is the lens through which communities can begin to look at all aspects of school safety, whether it's bullying or cyber safety, whether it's fire safety or intruder safety. We are asking folks to examine their practices and procedures through these 3 steps of a continuum. The first step being to assess, to critically look at what you've got, what's in place, what is working, and what needs help. The second step being to act, to create a plan of action, to create measures and practices that can be put in place to address the things that have been learned in that assessment step. And then the third step is to audit, to continually check and examine and rethink the plans and procedures and practices that you have put in place according to events in your community, according to what's being learned across the nation, and according to the expert advice and the local expertise that you have at your disposal. So based on these 3 steps of our model, we created toolkits, and those are available to you online for free. If you visit our website, you can unpack each of the toolkits, and you can get to them by simply visiting the Education tab on our navigation bar and dropping down to Toolkits, or by visiting the Get Involved tab and choosing your own page, your own customized page, according to which stakeholder group you happen to be most closely associated with, and you'll find a customized toolkit for Assess, Act, and Audit on that page for you. So I encourage you to take advantage of these resources and to make the most of them, to share them with those in your community and use them for discussion, use them for getting initiatives started and examining and really thinking critically about the plans and practices and measures that you have in place. I would like to close my talks by sharing with you the inspiration for me for this work in trying to advocate for safer schools, in trying to light the fire across the nation. My inspiration is always my daughter Josephine that I lost that day. The night before that she died that day, I was lucky enough to spend the night with her. She didn't want to let me go when I was tucking her in. And she had been trying to communicate something to me. She'd been trying to tell me something. And I was not able, unfortunately, to figure it out. She was nonverbal and autistic, so it was always quite a challenge. But I did say to her that I wouldn't give up. I promised her that I would eventually figure it out, and that no matter how hard it got, I promised that I would stick by her and I would always figure it out, because that's something that she did, despite all of the challenges of her life and the challenges of being a disabled young child who was nonverbal. She never gave up, and the smile that you see in each of these photographs is something she carried with her every day, and she showed up with it every day. So I encourage you to take that promise yourself, to keep it close to your heart. And despite the many challenges of creating a safe school environment for our students and our staff, I encourage you to stick with it and to never give up, because it's worth it, not just to my daughter, but to all of the children that you will touch in your efforts. I encourage you too to visit us at safeandsoundschools.org. You can also contact us, info@safeandsoundschools.org. You can follow us. We have a blog, which is often featuring special guests like Dr. Poland. We have a newsletter about once or twice a year we put out just to update our followers. And you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at safeschools.org. And you can consider supporting us through a donation, a sponsorship, or a fundraiser. All of your support ends up becoming what we use, basically, to continue this work and to continue providing free resources for communities in the interest of making safer schools. So I'd like to thank you all for attending today, for listening to me and walking with me through this journey. And of course, I'd like to thank PSI for making this webinar possible. And at this moment, I would like to hand it off to Dr. Poland so that you can hear and learn from his perspective and his years of expertise in school safety. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and I think I speak for everyone, and we're so sorry about your loss and what happened at Sandy Hook Elementary School, and dedication you have to focus on prevention and planning and collaboration between schools and community agencies is really very, very important. Well, I want to begin and talk a little bit about what happened in Ohio, because I know many of the PSI staff members and people tuning in are very aware of the shooting that happened at Chardon High School a number of years ago. And I don't seem to be able to advance my slides here, so I'll let PSI do that for me. But essentially, headline in the USA Today a number of years ago, picture of the young man on the front page, and the headline really talked about that he was just an ordinary kid. And I guess the point I really want to make, and do it as concisely as possible, is that these shooters are not ordinary kids. They have some pretty extreme mental health problems. And part of my message today is certainly going to be we have to know our students well, our families have to know our children well, we have to have mental health services that are available and affordable to all young people in this particular country. And there's an interesting an author, in fact I just heard from him the other day, it's Dr. Peter Langman. He wrote his first book on why kids kill, and he looked at 10 different rampage acts of violence at schools. And I just talked to him the other day, and he has a second book that's coming out where he's going to be reviewing 48 different tragic incidents of school shootings. But he essentially hypothesizes that there are 3 types of school shooters. And really what this means is back to the mental health and the ability to spot the warning signs. And those specific types in particular, we have the psychotic school shooter, we have the psychopathic school shooter, and then we have the traumatized/depressed school shooter. And really, it's important that we give some examples of each of those. And let's begin with one of the shooters at Columbine High School, which was the place where I was personally a responder. And although I don't like to add to the glorification of these shooters, I think it's important today that we do take a moment and look at some of the psychology types as well as some of the writing that they have left behind. And if we look at Eric Harris's writing, and I don't think I need to read it out loud to everybody, but obviously there's a great deal of anger there. The psychopath is really characterized by being extremely narcissistic. They don't have a conscience. They're very antisocial. They never show remorse. They can actually be very charming. They can tell people exactly what they want to hear, and at the same time, they have all of these really nasty and violent thoughts. about the person that they are in fact being charming to at the moment. And one of the other really interesting theories about school shooters, and an important point to make today, is that the majority of school shooters were actually suicidal. And those of you who know me well know that suicide prevention in schools has really been my highest priority. But so we have this strong connection. What do I mean by that? It means that uh, the reality is that they did not plan to survive these shootings. And essentially, um, they were often after either glory, and unfortunately, our media does, in fact, give these young people glory, or they were after revenge. And you'll see in the writings of Eric Harris about the extreme anger that he had. Uh, he wanted to do something that was going to be beyond anything that had ever been done before. So, and as we move on, so we need to recognize, first of all, the psychopathic school shooter. We need to recognize that there's often a motivation of either glory or revenge, feeling that they have somehow been mistreated. Now, as we look at the next slide, which has to do with the shooter from Paducah, Kentucky, uh, Michael Carneal, who, by the way, has tried for a new trial numerous times and has pleaded insanity, but he will remain in the Kentucky prisons for, I believe, a minimum of 40 years. So he was hearing voices. Um, he was seeing things that weren't there. He was taping over the vents in his room so evil spirits wouldn't get in. He was sleeping with a knife because he thought, there were monsters that lived in the basement of his house. So, main point here is not a good contact with reality at all. And as we move on to the third type, that would be the traumatized school shooter, the person that is depressed, that has this incredible history of losses and probably previous suicide attempts, lots of stress. Some of these young men in particular have fathers who were in prison for violent crimes. They just had a long and very traumatic history. And our next slide shows us some information about Jeffrey Weise from the shooting at the Reservation High School in Red Lake, Minnesota, which is another place where I did respond. And if we just take a moment and glance at the traumatic events in his life, it's really quite clear that this was a young person that needed dramatic interventions in our homes, communities, and in our schools. And the very next slide, Jeff basically posted online, and he posted a lot of information online, things that we should have recognized. He actually posted an incredibly well done animated story about the final day of his life and the shooting he had planned at his school. But you can tell that there's a great deal of pain and suffering. The idea that death would be welcoming, given the trauma that he had experienced in his life. And I'm often asked on this next slide, really what has changed and what are the key points about violence today? And the reality is we have had violent deaths at school for many decades in America. And in reality, the actual incidence has not dramatically increased. Of course, I'm the first person that believes one violent death on a school ground in America is totally unacceptable. But what has increased is an incidence where people are killing more than one individual, where we have multiple deaths. They're not just angry at one or two people, they're angry at everyone. And there have so often been signs of trouble in aggressive statements they have made and things they're posting and having a little shrine in their room to previous school shooters that it's so important that everyone, this would include the entire community, not just school personnel and parents as well, be alert to these warning signs. And without going into great details, because guns in America are a very divisive issue, and I'm not here to question anybody's right to own a gun, but simply to say, if you know you have a troubled person in your family, somebody who's depressed, they're impulsive, they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol, please don't leave a gun readily available to them. And now let's look at and move to a slide. This one has a lot of very practical ideas for schools, and to quickly summarize, we got to get students themselves involved in their own safety. We've got to talk with them about it. We have to survey, find out the extent of the problem, what they're concerned about. We need to have safety and anti-bullying pledges, and we need to teach them to de-escalate things rather to encourage fights or acts of violence. But the next slide has to do with the Secret Service prior knowledge study. And as you look at this, what's really clear to me is most school shootings should have been prevented because 81% of the time they talk to at least one other person, usually one of their peers. 59% of the time, more than one person was told about their violent plan. And one of the greatest challenges in our schools and our communities is to really address the question, why don't kids come forward? Why don't they tell us if somebody's talking about homicidal or suicidal plans? And what kids have told me, and really the literature also emphasizes this, they say things like, oh, I didn't think it could happen. Oh, I didn't want to get involved. I feared retaliation. I've been conditioned not to tell. Oh, I'm sorry, but I don't trust the adults to really be able to do anything about it. You know, I wrote an article for the School Board Journal called The Fourth R. That fourth R is relationships. We have to have a climate where every kid in the school in America feels connected to one or more adults, so they know how much we care about them, and they will be much more likely to come forward and tell us about homicidal or suicidal plans. Now I'd like to spend the remainder of my time looking at a couple of suggestions. And in particular, let's look at the suggestions for parents. And the bottom line is parents of adolescents have a right to know what's going on. And it's important that parents go in and out of their room. And if parents had done this in a number of situations, they would have found the violent writings. They would have been aware of some of the things that were being posted on the computer. They would have been aware of the articles on the bulletin board that were basically glamorizing school shooters. And I do believe we should pay more attention to exposure to media violence, especially children at younger ages. The literature says, thankfully, only a small percentage of young people are really influenced by violent movies, television, violent video games. But the bottom line is some of them are. And of course, the most common parental response when your kid is in trouble is to basically try to deny what's happened, try to get them out of that trouble, try to prevent them from experiencing consequences. And the bottom line is don't lie to protect your child. Let them experience consequences. All children misbehave. How they learn is through receiving those consequences. So let the due process proceed. And when someone in the school is telling you that your child has a serious problem, that you need to get some mental health treatment, don't be defensive. Don't think they're telling you you're a bad parent. Don't attack them. Realize they sincerely have recognized the problem. And I've already talked a little bit about guns, so let's move on to the next one. And really a good question about school shootings is, frankly, anyone could prevent a school shooting. That could be a parent that's alert to how troubled their child is. That could be an alert community member. That could be a teacher. That could be another student. And of course, it's extremely important that all schools have a threat assessment team. That's a group of people, usually a mental health professional, the administrator, law enforcement, teachers who know the kid in question well. They ask a lot of questions. They gather a lot of information. And threats tend to basically fall into two categories. Transient, which are threats made in a moment of anger or passion, and substantial, which means there's a grudge, there's a weapon, there's a long history. And especially those substantial threats do require extensive consequences. And schools are really wrestling with lots of school safety questions about what to do. I've already stressed one of the things I think is the most important, which is to get the students themselves involved in the process. And I understand the importance of surveillance cameras, and I do support more school resource officers. But we also have to work on things in the curriculum like anger management and getting a commitment from the students and understanding really school safety is an inside job. We got to get a commitment from the students first, then the faculty, parents, and the community. And certainly we need suicide prevention and bullying prevention programs in all of our schools, and we need anonymous tip lines so that students can let administrators know when violent actions and plans are something that could be happening and that students are thinking about them. The next slide looks at a couple of other things that I want to talk about in terms of the importance of really, do we need to arm our teachers with a weapon? I think we need to arm them with small classes, arm them with mental health professionals, arm them with the ability to get to know students. Those would be the things that I would certainly propose are the most important. And then I've mentioned that we do need to know the real statistics about schools and that they really are the safest places that kids go. And I certainly agree with a lot of recommendations that Michelle has made in terms of meeting and greeting everyone and having that double set of doors. And right now, a phrase that's really used a lot is active shooter drills. Well, as a psychologist, I want to say only a couple of things. First of all, we should do a pre and post test. If we conduct a drill, let's find out do people feel safer? Wouldn't that be the hope after a drill is conducted? And we need to know the trauma history of students and faculty. And in my mind, we need to simply practice moving kids to a safe and protected position, helping them learn to listen to the nearest adult and do what they say. And I think we can do all those things without gunfire sounds and doing anything that might be scary. The next slide sort of summarizes points that I've already made about mental health services. I'm going to speak very honestly. I was the president of a National Association of School Psychologists, and they spend their time doing special education assessment. If I use the example of Florida where I reside, about one school psychologist every 3,000 students. So they're not doing counseling. They're not doing mental health interventions. And school counselors around the country are increasingly doing clerical scheduling duties, and they often have a ratio of about 1 to 700. So when are we going to actually put the mental health resources in our schools? When are we going to recognize that we have to make sure that every kid in America in school today feels like somebody cares whether or not they showed up or not? And at the simplest level, obviously, the school should be a place where kids like to be, a place that they would never think about blowing up or harming anyone. And the last slide before we take questions, really one of my favorite quotes, and it's from a survivor at Columbine, a young man who lost his sister. He says, "We must reach out to the unreachable." The words of Craig Scott. And I believe we do have unreachable students in all of our schools, and we have to figure out how to reach them. Let me turn it back to Karen McKelvey at PSI. Thank you for listening.
I want to thank both of you, Michelle and Scott, for a very compelling presentation. We really appreciate it. I do have a couple of questions. I'm going to go through them. Some of them have been partially answered, but I just thought it would be important to reiterate some of this because it's obviously on people's minds. This one is interesting, directed to Michelle. Michelle, I noticed you never mentioned the name of the shooter. Was this purposeful?
You know, It is and it isn't. I didn't realize that until recently that when I present and when I talk about the shooter, I very rarely ever use his name, and I think it's just because yeah, like Scott talked about, it's important to not glorify anyone who takes such actions against the community. I think we've learned from a lot of these incidents that that's a very motivating factor for a lot of these assailants. So that's certainly part of it. And then the other part, I suppose, is that I really try very hard to keep my focus on my daughter and on her memory and on the school and the community. So this is not so much about one individual. It's much more about the community and about honoring our community and the the children and teachers that we lost that day. So it's a complex answer.
Yes, it is, but I think excellent. Thank you very much. This one's for Scott. The question is, who should be on a crisis team, and how can we get them trained?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, I think people on a crisis team should want to be there. We shouldn't force anyone to be on the team. And logically, we're looking at counselors, social workers, school psychologists, nurses. We're looking at school administrators. We're looking at resource officers and even some teachers. And there are a number of excellent training resources around the country. National Organization of Victims Assistance, Red Cross, Critical Incident Stress Management, as well as the National Association of School Psychologists has the Prepare model, which is really designed to train individuals who work in schools. And that does make that model stand out from the first three that I mentioned.
Okay, great. Thank you. I actually can say that PSI has a crisis team, and we actually were trained by Dr. Poland. So we know how thorough a job he can do in that kind of training. We're so appreciative of that. I have another question, Michelle, for you. It says, what are one or two things that my school can do to prepare students without scaring them?
Well, it's hard to say just one, to be honest with you, but I think it
Sure,
all begins with that community involvement. It really needs to be a collaborative process, and Scott alluded to this a little bit. It's important that students are involved. It's important that parents are involved, cafeteria staff, anybody who has a stake in the school community needs to have a say and needs to have a seat at the table. But I think it has an enormous amount to do with education, if I can just state it simply as one thing. It's all about the amount of education that we have. Education empowers us. It gives us a greater sense of confidence when we are facing an emergency or an unexpected situation. So I would say education is enormous, and I think that's why we've chosen at Safe and Sound to concentrate our efforts there. It's our mission to provide as many resources and as many experts and as many different views as possible so that schools are able to create what is most customized and most appropriate for the culture and for their own specific community.
Okay, thank you. A question that just came in. It says, how do I know my school is doing everything they can to be safe? And maybe we can throw that out to the two of you. How do I know my school is doing everything they can do to be safe?
One of the things I really recommend is that schools need a safety task force, and they should certainly be collaborating with the community and agencies, but they should be welcome the input from parents. So I would encourage that particular person to contact the school, set up a meeting with the principal, ask some questions, and just make sure that their child's school really is up to date with the best practice.
And I think I can
Okay,
echo
oh.
completely what Scott's saying
Mhm.
there. It's all about being involved. Unless you are involved, it's very difficult to have a handle upon anything that any initiatives or any practices that are in place. So it is really largely about involvement, and I know that that's a challenge in a lot of communities. I certainly, as a parent, wouldn't go in expecting to receive the alarm codes or the specs on the windows and the hardware of the school, but there's absolutely no reason that every stakeholder in the building shouldn't know the plan. People need to be informed. They need to know what the vocabulary is, what the language is, and what the objectives are, what the main points are in any type of emergency.
Okay, great. I have one final one, and Scott, I think you somewhat answered this, but maybe just to reiterate. The question is, if I have a safety concern at my school, how can I comfortably report it if I'm feeling uncomfortable about this?
Well, I'd like to hope that there's free and easy dialogue between teachers and the administration to be able to address these issues. I'd like to think that parents feel like they could schedule a meeting and ask some questions. And of course, I really like it when schools keep the parents informed on here are all our safety practices, here's what we are doing, here are the activities that we are putting in place. And I guess, the bottom line, if somebody doesn't feel like they can come forward to the principal, then they might have to alert somebody else in higher administration, and hopefully appropriate action will be taken.
Okay, great. And I know you also mentioned that many schools have a hotline that is confidential, so perhaps that's another resource for people if they really are feeling that they're disconnected on some level. Well, we've reached the end of our available time. I do want to reiterate that we will be posting this webinar, recording of it on the PSI website shortly. If you have participated today, when you log off, you will receive a survey, which once you complete it will put you in the queue to have a certificate of completion generated. This will come via email, and it will take give us a week or so for this certificate to arrive. So once again, thank you so much, Michelle and Scott, and all of you who attended. We really appreciate it.